Winning United Fellowship, Pastor Dooba here, and I hope you're doing well. I've just been thinking about this last Sunday, and I'm here in my office with my Bible, and I just wanted to share something. I did this last week as well, try to put some feet, if you will, on the theology concept that we talked about on Sunday. On Sunday, we were going through Ephesians chapter 2, verses 1 through 10. The sermon was entitled, A Transformed Identity, and that just reminded me of the story of Saul, and really a practical look at what that really looks like to have somebody who was doing their own thing apart from God. Then, as we talked about on Sunday as well, the but God happened. And that really, those two words are part of every one of our testimonies. But God showed up and Saul became a new person. Not only did his name change, but who he was, how he did life, his calling, his obedience to the Lord totally shifted. In Acts chapter 8, we learned that Saul, was approved for executing believers. Stoning of Stephen had just happened, and then Paul goes about and he is trying to put an end to these people who seem to be following Jesus with a passion, with a fervor. And in chapter 9, we learn about his conversion, and it says in verse 1 that Saul was still breathing threats, murderous threats against the disciples of the Lord. So not only was his name Saul, which we know was part of his past life, but his identity, who he was, what he did, what he believed his calling to be was to hold fast to the Pharisaical way of living, the Jewish rite, if you will, as opposed to following Jesus. And so Saul had gotten permission to go to Damascus, a town further away, to find people who were following Jesus and then bring them back so they could be put in jail or punished. Really try to be converted back to Judaism, show them that following the way, as it was called, or as we would know now as to be following Jesus as a Christian, was wrong. So he's on his way, and we know this story well. Jesus shows up to him, and it says a bright light from heaven shone around him as he was on his way, and he fell to the ground, and he heard a voice saying, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And he says, who are you, Lord? And he says, I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. And in that point, that really was Saul's but God moment for him. He was doing his own thing, but God shows up to him in this light on the road and says, what are you doing? What are you doing? And then we find out just in just a little bit, he goes to Damascus. A few days later, his eyes are reopened. He begins to learn and to study. He then is engaged by God and said, you know what? Your calling was your calling and not my calling for you. And God shows up and says, I have a new plan for your life. And Paul then becoming really the most well-known, most influential, probably missionary in the entire world since his time even to today. But what's interesting is just because Saul, I should say, became a follower of Jesus, his name did not automatically change. That was in chapter 9. It says later on in chapter 9 that Paul begins to go to the synagogues, proclaim Jesus. Then he escapes from Damascus because the Jews who he used to be working with are now trying to kill him. And then he goes to Jerusalem. We learn about Peter a little bit more. So that's chapter 9. Chapter 10 goes on. Chapter 11 goes on. And it's not actually until chapter 13 that Paul's name is actually changed. Saul's name is changed to Paul as we know it. I'm going back and forth between the two names. To me, it seems like I'm just so used to saying Paul because that's who God made him to be. The person Saul, he was doing his own thing, his own path, but God showed up. So I just want to ask you this question. Maybe you can leave an answer in the comments. What was your but God moment like? Where were you going before, and then God showed up and said, I have a new plan, a new calling for your life? What was that identity change like? Not just the name change that you suddenly started putting the word Christian in front of your name, but what was the shift like for you? I'd love to hear from you. And even if not, share with a friend, share with another brother or sister in Christ, share with them your but God moment. I know that God will be glorified through you sharing that. I hope to see you all very soon.